Chapter 9. Preceding and during the second period in the Negro's theatrical development, there were a number of what might be termed semi-professional companies that went from town to town, making their own engagements and hiring theaters, halls, or churches for their performances. These efforts were generally of an ambitious character. Of these small troupes, the best were those whose programs were mostly musical. The musical troupes actually antedated the minstrels, and the best of them was one of the very earliest, the Luca family. This troupe originally consisted of 6 members, father, mother, and 4 sons, all of them highly talented. The father was born in Milford, Connecticut, and the sons were born and reared in New Haven. The Luca family gained its first wide public recognition in singing at the anniversary of the Anti-Slavery Society held in the old Broadway Tabernacle in 1853. Accounts of their appearance record, quote-unquote, the wildest enthusiasm. The company traveled through the northern and western states and gained a high reputation. But in the professional theater, the first successful departure made by the Negro from strict minstrelsy was in 1890. Sam T. Jack, a prominent burlesque theater owner and manager, conceived the idea of putting out a Negro show different from anything yet thought of, a show that would glorify the colored girl. He got together some clever men, among them Sam Lucas, Fred Piper, Billy Jackson, and Irving Jones, and a chorus of the 16 most beautiful colored girls he could secure, and opened the Creole show. The Creole show gave great prominence to girls and was smart and up-to-date in material and costumes. It had none of the features of plantation days. Nevertheless, it was cast in the traditional minstrel pattern. There was first a minstrel part, differing, however, from the regular minstrel show in that the girls were in the center of the line, with a female interlocuteur, and the men on the ends. Then came an olio, and then the finale. Notwithstanding, it was the start along a line which led straight to the musical comedies of Cole and Johnson, Williams and Walker, and Ernest Hogan. The important performers were assembled in New York. The company rehearsed at Haverhill, Massachusetts, and the show had its real opening at the Howard in Boston. The Creoles opened in Chicago in 1891. During the whole season of the World's Fair, 1893, they played at Sam T. Jack's Opera House in that city. They created something of a sensation in New York when they edged up to the quote-unquote Broadway zone by playing at the Old Standard Theater in Greeley Square. The Creole show ran for 5 or 6 seasons. A year or so after the organization of the Creoles, Weldon and Martell, 2 white managers brought up from Louisville, Kentucky, a show called South Before the War. This was an entertainment made up of plantation scenes, songs, and dances, with some specialties. It was popular in the burlesque houses and played for several seasons. In 1895, John W. Isham, who had been the advance agent of the Creole show, went out for himself and produced the Octoroons. This company was organized in New York, and following it, every important Negro theatrical production has been organized there. The Octoroons was a step further along than the Creole show, but it also adhered in a general way to the minstrel pattern. It was billed, quote-unquote, a musical farce, but it was made up of a first part, a middle part, and a finale, neither one having any sequential connection with the others. The first part consisted of an opening chorus and a medley of songs done by the various principals, generally assisted by the girls of the chorus. The middle part was a burlesque sketch in which a number of specialties were strung on a very thin thread of story. The show closed with a cakewalk jubilee, a military drill, and a, quote, chorus march finale. The synopsis declared all the scenes to be laid in New York City. Like the Creole show, the Octoroons made a special feature of the girls, but not only as chorus members. A half dozen of them were used as principals. The Octoroons, as did both its predecessors, played the burlesque houses. In 1896, Mr. Isham produced Oriental America. This was a more ambitious production than the Octoroons, for although it was built on the minstrel model, the afterpiece, instead of being made up of burlesque and specialties, cakewalk, hold down, and walk around finale, was a medley of operatic selections. Mr. Isham, in addition to having in the company clever performers and pretty girls, had some of the best trained Negro singers available. He signed Sidney Woodward, who had quite a reputation in Boston as a tenor. J. Rosamond Johnson, then a student of music in the same city, William C. Elkins, Miss Maggie Scott, and several others who had made a study of singing. Miss Inez Clew, who more recently has achieved success in Negro dramatic plays, was also a member of the company. The finale of the show consisted of solos and choruses from Faust, Martha, Rigoletto, Carmen, and Il Trovatore. Oriental America broke all precedents by being the first colored show to play Broadway proper. It opened at Wallack's Theater, at that time called Palmer's. Oriental America broke further away from the minstrel patterns than did the Creole show and the Octoroons, and it was the first colored show to make a definite break from the burlesque houses. In the meantime, Worth's Museum at 6th Avenue and 30th Street had virtually become a Negro stock theater, the first place where a group of colored performers were able to gain anything approaching dramatic training and experience on the strictly professional stage. The company was composed of 12 to 15 performers, both men and women, and was for a period headed by Bob Cole, who had been a member of the Creole show. He was both playwright and stage manager, and provided a series of sketches and plays that made Worth's Museum all-star stock company very popular. At this time, Bob Cole was about 26 years old, but he was already evincing the powers which were to make him the greatest single force in the middle period of the development of the Negro in the American theater. He was the most versatile theatrical man the Negro has yet produced, a good singer and an excellent dancer, and able to play several musical instruments. He could write a dramatic or a musical play, dialogue, lyrics, and music, stage the play, and act a part. In his role as a tramp, he received the highest praise of the critics. Moreover, he was educated and a serious student of the whole history of the theater and the drama. And now a slight digression. Beginning quite early, colored singers made considerable headway on the concert stage. Contrary to what holds true at the present time, the most successful of them were women. As far back as 1851, Elizabeth Taylor Greenfield, known as the quote-unquote Black Swan, attracted attention by singing for the Buffalo Musical Association. She followed this appearance with concerts before discriminating audiences in the larger cities and towns upstate in New York and through New England and the Middle Western states. She then decided to visit Europe. Thereupon, the citizens of Buffalo tendered her a benefit concert, which took place on March 7, 1853. A few weeks later, she appeared in a successful concert before a very large audience in New York City, and on April 6th, she sailed for England. She made an astonishing impression on the English public, and on May 4th, 1854, she was quote-unquote commanded to attend at Buckingham Palace and sing before Queen Victoria. The Black Swan died in Philadelphia in 1876. Just about the time of her death, the Hire sisters, Anna Mada and Emma Louise, were at the top of their popularity. These two sisters, one a soprano and the other a contralto, gave concerts in which they were well received throughout all the northern and western states. Then came the first colored singer with both the natural voice and the necessary training and cultivation, Mimi Marie Salika. Mimi Salika studied under good teachers in the United States and in Europe, becoming proficient in German and French, especially German, which she made her second language. She sang with success in this country and abroad. She is at present a teacher of singing in the Martin Smith School of Music in Harlem. Several others gained notice also, among them Flora Batson, who possessed an almost unnatural range and was a marvelous singer of ballads. But the most popular of all these women singers was Cissy Retta Jones, known as the Black Patty. The height of her career was so recent that her name and fame will be recalled by a great many who read these lines. She had most of the qualities essential in a great singer: the natural voice, the physical figure, the grand air, and the engaging personality. Cissy Retta Jones had studied and been singing in concert for several years, but first gained wide publicity by her singing at a Jubilee spectacle and cakewalk which was staged at Madison Square Garden, April 26 to 28, 1892, for which she had been specially engaged. She sang 3 nights and carried off the honors of the affair. The next day, the New York papers gave her space and headlines, and by one critic, she was dubbed Black Patty. Her manager was emboldened to take her to the Academy of Music, which had been dark all the week, and she sang there to large audiences for 2 nights immediately after the close of the Jubilee. So great was the sensation she created that there was talk of having her sing the dark roles in Aida and L'Africaine at the Metropolitan Opera House. In fact, she was signed by Abbey, Schoffel, and Grau, then managers of the Metropolitan. But the plans for grand opera were not carried out, and she was booked on the concert stage. Later, she came under the management of Major Pond. In September 1892, she was invited by President Harrison to sing at a White House reception. Later, in the same month, she was engaged to sing for a week at the Pittsburgh Exposition as soloist with Levy's band. That season, she toured the country as a soloist with the band. The following year, she was engaged again to sing at the Pittsburgh Exposition, this time as soloist with Gilmore's band. She then made a concert tour of Europe, which lasted nearly a year. When Black Patty returned, she came under the management of Volkel and Nolan of New York, who carried out their plan of taking Cissy Retta Jones off the concert stage and presenting her in an all-Negro show. They engaged Bob Cole to write it, and in the same season with Oriental America, Black Patty's Troubadours was produced. Black Patty's Troubadours, too, in a general way followed the minstrel pattern. The first part was a sketchy farce interspersed with songs and choruses and ending with a buck dance contest. Then followed an olio. The finale was termed the Operatic Kaleidoscope, and in it, Black Patty appeared in songs and operatic selections with the chorus. She took no other part in the show, but was the great drawing card. The Troubadours played season after season for a number of years. One reason for the long life of the show was Black Patty's great popularity in the South. The Troubadours, alone among the larger colored shows, was able to play successfully in the South. Cissy Retta Jones has retired from both the theatrical and the concert stage and lives at her home in Providence, Rhode Island. During the first season of the Troubadours, while the company was playing at Proctor's 58th Street Theater in New York, Bob Cole had a serious disagreement with Messrs. Volkel and Nolan regarding salary. Not reaching a satisfactory agreement, he gathered up the music that he had written and walked out with it. This action led to his arrest, and he was hailed into court. Before the magistrate he declared, quote, "These men have amassed a fortune from the product of my brain, and now they call me a thief. I won't give it up." End quote. However, as is usual, the stronger side won. But the rupture between Bob Cole and the managers of the Troubadours marked an epoch in Negro theatricals, for he began at once to plan a play of his own. In the season of 1898-99, he came out with A Trip to Coontown, the first Negro show to make a complete break from the minstrel pattern, the first that was not a mere potpourri, the first to be written with continuity and to have a cast of characters working out the story of a plot from beginning to end, and therefore the first Negro musical comedy. It was furthermore the first colored show to be organized, produced, and managed by Negroes. Some of the best performers then on the stage united with Cole in A Trip to Coontown. Among them, Billy Johnson, who became Cole's partner and was the Johnson of the first Cole and Johnson combination, Sam Lucas, and Jesse Shipp, who later was the directing genius in the construction of the Williams and Walker plays. A Trip to Coontown ran 3 seasons. The summer of 1898 marked another great step forward. Will Marion Cook composed the music to a sketch entitled Clorinda, the Origin of the Cakewalk, with the lyrics by Paul Laurence Dunbar. The play was produced by George W. Lederer at the Casino Roof Garden and ran the entire summer season. The cast included Ernest Hogan, a veteran minstrel and a very funny natural blackface comedian. and Miss Belle Davis, who later made a success in Europe and stayed there. Hogan was a notable exception among blackface comedians. His comedic efforts did not depend upon the caricature created by the use of cork and a mouth exaggerated by paint. His mobile face was capable of laughter-provoking expressions that were irresistible, notwithstanding the fact that he was a very good-looking man. Some critics ranked him higher than Bert Williams. He had greater unction than Bert Williams, and by that very token lacked Williams' subtlety and finish. Clarindy was the talk of New York. It was the first demonstration of the possibilities of syncopated Negro music. Cook was the first competent composer to take what was then known as ragtime and work it out in a musicianly way. His choruses and finales in Clarindy, complete novelties as they were, sung by a lusty chorus, were simply breathtaking. Broadway had something entirely new. The following summer, another musical playlet, Just Like White Folks, written by Cook, was produced at the New York Winter Garden. In this playlet, Cook was less fortunate in his sketch material and in his cast. Hogan had gone to the Antipodes at the head of the Senegambians under the management of M.B. Curtis of Samuel of Posen fame. Curtis skipped and left the company stranded in Australia. Just Like White Folks had among its principals a girl named Abby Mitchell, who was later to be important in Negro musical comedy and dramatics. Irving Jones was the comedian. Will Marion Cook continued to develop his distinctive style in composing the music for the later shows of Williams and Walker. Chapter 10. Williams and Walker came from out of the West. They came singing one of the catchiest songs of the day, Dora Dean, which they themselves had written after the quite adequate inspiration of a sight of Miss Dora Dean, one of the famed beauties of the Creole show. They reached New York in 1896. They had been together as a team for several years, undergoing all the special vicissitudes of a colored vaudeville team of the period. When they were engaged to appear in The Gold Bug, produced at the Casino Theater by Canary and Lederer, The Gold Bug did not quite catch Broadway's fancy, but Williams and Walker did, and after the failure of the Casino show, they were engaged for the famous Coster and Biles, where they played a record run of 40 weeks. It was during this engagement that Williams and Walker made the cakewalk not only popular, but fashionable. They were assisted by two girls. One of them, Stella Wiley, was the cleverest colored soubrette of the day. Cakewalk pictures posed for by the quartet were reproduced in colors and widely distributed as advertisements by one of the big cigarette concerns, and the execution of cakewalk steps was taken up by society. Cakewalking became such a society fad that on Sunday morning, January 16, 1898, Williams and Walker, dressed just a point or two above the height of fashion, dared, as a publicity stunt, to call at the home of William K. Vanderbilt and leave the following letter. To Mr. William K. Vanderbilt, corner of 52nd Street and 5th Avenue, New York. Dear Sir, in view of the fact that you have made a success as a cakewalker, having appeared in a semi-public exhibition and having posed as an expert in that capacity, we, the undersigned, world-renowned cakewalkers, believing that the attention of the public has been distracted from us on account of the tremendous hit which you have made, hereby challenge you to compete with us in a cakewalking match, which will decide which of us shall deserve the title of champion cakewalker of the world. As a guarantee of good faith, we have this day deposited at the office of the New York World the sum of $50. If you purpose proving to the public that you really are an expert cakewalker, we shall be pleased to have you cover that amount and name the day on which it will be convenient for you to try odds against us. Yours very truly, Williams and Walker. Regarding the size of the stakes, Williams, who habitually left all business matters to Walker, is reported as saying, quote, "It's a shame to take the money, so make the stakes small, George." End quote. The two comedians next tried the London music halls, but the English appeared not to be able to understand or appreciate their particular brand of humor. So they came back to New York and went out at the head of a mediocre show, a Senegambian carnival, which promptly stranded. They followed with 4-11-44, afterwards changed to the Policy Players. This was also a failure. In 1900, they brought out the Sons of Ham, and in this humorous, pathetic musical farce, they struck their stride. In 1902, they produced In Dahomey and made Negro theatrical history by opening at the very center of theaterdom, at the New York Theater in Times Square. In the spring of 1903, In Dahomey was taken to London. The two principals, remembering their reception in the London music halls, were somewhat apprehensive about the venture, but the show was a success and ran for 7 months at the Shaftesbury Theatre, afterwards touring the provinces. The unquestioned stamp of approval was put on it when, at the end of the first month, the company received a royal command for a performance at Buckingham Palace on June 23rd. The performance was part of the celebration in honor of the 9th birthday of the present Prince of Wales, and was given on a stage erected on the lawn. In Dahomey made the cakewalk a social fad in England and France. In 1906, Williams and Walker opened with In Abyssinia at the Majestic Theater in Columbus Circle, New York. This was followed by Bandana Land in 1907. Bandana Land was the last play in which Williams and Walker appeared together. During its run, George Walker's health broke, and he never again stepped on the stage. The Williams and Walker Company was, all in all, the strongest Negro theatrical combination that has yet been assembled. In addition to Williams and Walker, there were Jesse Shipp, Alex Rogers, Will Marion Cook, and Ada Overington. Mr. Shipp had long theatrical experience, beginning with minstrelsy, and it was who worked out the details of the construction of the plays, after the idea had been discussed and adopted by the above-named heads. Mr. Rogers was the lyricist and the author of the words to many of the most popular of the Williams and Walker songs, among them Why Adam Sinned, I May Be Crazy But I Ain't No Fool, The Jonah Man, Bon Bon Buddy, The Chocolate Drop, and Nobody. He also contributed much of the droll humor and many of the ludicrous situations for which these plays were noted. Mr. Cook, of whom we have already spoken, was the composer-in-chief. Ada Overton, Mrs. George Walker, was beyond comparison the brightest star among women on the Negro stage of the period, and it is a question whether or not she has since been surpassed. She was an attraction in the company not many degrees less than the two principals, and there was also one of the best singing choruses ever heard on a musical comedy stage. Of course, the main strength of the combination centered in the two comedians, George Walker as the sleek, smiling, prancing dandy, and Bert Williams as the slow-witted, good-natured, shuffling darky. Together, they achieved something beyond mere fun. They often achieved the truest comedy through the ability they had to keep the tears close up under the loudest laughter. Bert Williams went out alone in 1909 in Mr. Load of Coal, which had little success and was the last Negro show in which he ever appeared. The next year he was engaged for the Ziegfeld Follies and remained a member of the cast for practically 10 seasons. In 1920, he was the star in Broadway Brevities, and in 1922, the star in the Pink Slip, which after a tryout was rewritten and called Under the Bamboo Tree. He was a sick man when he went out with this last play, and after it had been on the road but a few weeks, he had to be brought back to New York. He died March 11th, 1922, not yet 47 years old. Bert Williams goes down as one of America's great comedians. He has had few equals in the art of pantomime, a judgment with which those who saw him in his poker scene will agree. In the singing of a plaintive Negro song, he was beyond approach. His singing of Nobody was perfection. After 3 seasons with Cole and Johnson's A Trip to Coontown, Bob Cole in 1901 formed a partnership with another Johnson, this time J. Rosamond Johnson, the musician and singer, and the new Cole and Johnson became headliners in big-time vaudeville. They sang their own songs and were a success in this country and in Europe. In the meantime, they collaborated on the writing of white musical plays, and through this, some of their songs gained worldwide popularity. In 1906, Cole and Johnson wrote and appeared in a musical play called The Shoefly Regiment, which played in New York at the Bijou Theater on Broadway. In 1908, they came out in another play of their own, The Red Moon. Each of these plays was a true operetta with a well-constructed book and a tuneful, well-written score. On these 2 points, no Negro musical play has equaled The Red Moon. The Cole and Johnson combination lacked any such fun makers as were Williams and Walker, but in some other respects they excelled their great rivals. Their plays on the whole were better written, and they carried a younger, sprightlier, and prettier chorus which, though it could not sing so powerfully, could outdance the heavier chorus of the other company by a wide margin. The break in health that ended the careers of Bob Cole and George Walker, and the defection of Bert Williams to the white stage, all happening within a brief period of time, put a sudden stop to what had been a steady development and climb of the Negro in the theater. In this first decade of the century, plays headed by Ernest Hogan and Smart and Williams and S.H. Dudley and some other performers were produced, but all these shows, though organized in New York, were road shows and of secondary merit. The Hogan shows Rufus Rastus, and the Oyster Man were the most important of them. Hogan might have carried on because he was a splendid comedian and had a New York reputation, but he died a short while before George Walker's retirement. There came an interval, and the efforts of the Negro in New York in the theater were for a while transferred to Harlem. Chapter 11. Towards the close of the minstrel era and during the middle theatrical period, the Negro in New York gained an important place among the makers of the nation's songs. For a century or more, the Negro in America had been a folk song maker. Blackface minstrelsy, in its beginnings, depended for its songs almost entirely on the Negro plantation jingles. In the earliest attempts to write songs for the minstrel stage, there was merely slavish imitation or outright appropriation of this folk material. It is plain that even so great a songwriter as Stephen Foster, who wrote his best songs when he lived in Cincinnati, just across the river from Kentucky, was greatly indebted to the enormous supply of Negro folk song material at hand. But quite early the Negro emerged as an individual songmaker. Foster, America's first real songwriter, was at his height in the 50s, and in 1855 there appeared a song which became as popular and remains as lasting as any song he wrote, with the exception perhaps of My Old Kentucky Home, Old Folks at Home, and Old Black Joe. In Philadelphia there lived a colored barber named Richard Milburn, who worked in his father's shop on Lombard Street near 6th. He was a guitar player and a marvelous whistler, and it was he who originated the melody and at least the title of Listen to the Mockingbird. Credit for this song is given to Septimus Winter, or to Alice Hawthorne, which was his mother's name, under which he published some of his compositions. But the truth is that Winter only set down the melody and arranged it after it had been played and whistled and sung over to him by Milburn. Winter or someone else may have furnished most or all of the words, but the life of the song springs from the melody. Old colored residents of Philadelphia used to relate that before the song was ever published, Milburn played and whistled it at several gatherings, notably at a concert that was given at St. Thomas's Church, the colored Episcopal church in Philadelphia. But the incontrovertible proof of Milburn's part in the making of the song is shown by its title page, as originally published by Winter and Schuster under the copyright date of 1855, which reads, quote, Sentimental Ethiopian Ballad, Listen to the Mockingbird, melody by Richard Milburn, written and arranged by Alice Hawthorne. The title page of the song, as published by Lee and Walker under the copyright date of 1856, reads, Listen to the Mockingbird, as sung by Rose Merrifield, written and arranged by Alice Hawthorne. Richard Milburn's name has not since appeared on the song. One of the most popular of the minstrel songs of the 70s was Carve Dat Possum, written by Sam Lucas. Then from the ranks of the Negro minstrels there rose a really great songwriter in James Bland, who has already been mentioned. Bland wrote a long list of songs, of which 4 at least possess the qualities that entitle him to place in the front rank of American songwriters. They are Carry Me Back to Old Virginny, Oh Dem Golden Slippers, In the Morning by the Bright Light, and In the Evening by the Moonlight. Where is there the close harmony quartet that has not reveled in the possibilities for barbershop chords furnished by In the Evening by the Moonlight? Frequently upon occasions, Carry Me Back to Old Virginia is used in lieu of a state song. The bust of Patrick Henry was unveiled at the Hall of Fame May 8, 1930. The governor of Virginia delivered the address of dedication, and immediately after the unveiling, the trumpeters played Carry Me Back to Old Virginia. All of Bland's songs hark back to the South, a South of tenderness and beauty. Following him came Gussie L. Davis, a typical New York writer whose songs have not the slightest relation to the South or even to the Negro. Davis was a writer of popular ballads and as such had no superior. As anyone familiar with the songs of a generation ago will agree, among many other songs he wrote, Down in Poverty Row, The Fatal Wedding, In a Lighthouse by the Sea, We Sat Beneath the Maple on the Hill, Send Back the Picture and the Wedding Ring, and The Baggage Coach Ahead. The close of the 90s and the following decade was the high watermark period of the colored writers of popular songs in New York. Some were writers of one or perhaps two songs that caught the public, and others wrote long lists of hits. Let those with an interest in the old songs muse for a moment over the following bit of cataloging. Ernest Hogan wrote one song that swept this and other countries, a song which he, later in life, expressed regret at ever having written. It was All Coons Look Alike to Me. The melody of the song was beautiful and the words quite innocuous, but the title became a byword and an epithet of derision. Another writer of a single hit with a title that became a catchphrase was Al Johns, who wrote, Go way back and sit down. He wrote a number of other songs, some of them beautiful love ballads, but it was this musical oddity that brought him his moment of fame. Will Echo wrote My Samoan Beauty. Chris Smith, with R.C. McPherson doing the words, wrote Good Morning Carrie, a song with a melody that sang itself. Tim Brim, with R.C. McPherson, wrote Please Go Away and Let Me Sleep, and Josephine My Joe. Shepard Edmonds wrote I'm Going to Live Anyhow Until I Die. Irving Jones, a happy-go-lucky philosopher and song, wrote I'm Living Easy and Take Your Clothes and Go. Williams and Walker had everybody singing Dora Dean, Why Don't You Get a Lady of Your Own, I Don't Like No Cheap Men, When It's All Going Out and Nothing Coming In, and other songs besides. The Cole and Johnson combination, through their collaboration on Broadway musical plays, wrote a string of popular hits. Among them were Under the Bamboo Tree, The Congo Love Song, The Maiden with the Dreamy Eyes, Nobody's Looking But the Owl and the Moon, Lazy Moon, My Castle on the Nile, I've Got Troubles of My Own, Tell Me Dusky Maiden, I Must Have Been a Dreaming, and Oh, Didn't He Ramble? The Cole and Johnson songs were sung by the most popular musical comedy stars of the day, Mae Irvin, Mary Cahill, Faye Templeton, Lillian Russell, Anna Held, Virginia Earle, Marie George, Maybelle Gilman. Will Marion Cook wrote Exhortation, Rain Song, and Bon Bon Buddy, The Chocolate Drop, with words by Alex Rogers. Bert Williams with Rogers wrote Jonah Man, I may be crazy, but I ain't no fool, Nobody, and Why Adam Sinned, better known perhaps as Adam Never Had No Mammy. There were also several writers of popular instrumental music, the outstanding one being Will Tyers, who wrote La Chocha, La Mariposa, and Maori. This list of writers could be extended, as could the list of songs by the several writers, but here is enough to indicate how important the Negro in New York came to be in the making of popular songs for the American people. There are at present a score or so of colored writers of popular songs in New York actively at work in that profession. Outstanding among them are Jimmy Johnson, Spencer Williams, Andy Razaf, and Thomas Fats Waller, who together wrote My Fate Is in Your Hands, which is now very popular, and Maceo Pincard, who wrote Mammy, a song made famous by Al Jolson. 8 or 10 Negro writers are members of the American Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers, where they are recognized on an equal footing with others. This organization has for its purpose the collecting of royalty for the performance of music written by its members that may be performed in the theaters, broadcasting stations, hotels, restaurants, cabarets, and such places. There are similar societies in other countries, but the American Society is the strongest in the world. Last year, it distributed among its members nearly $1.5 million. In the meantime, Harry T. Burleigh was writing songs which were to give him his place among American composers. In the work of writing the more musicianly songs, J. Rosamond Johnson and Will Marion Cook also took part. These 3 men, unlike the other songwriters named, are thoroughly trained musicians. Mr. Burleigh was a student at the National Conservatory of Music in New York, while Anton Dvorak was director. He studied harmony with Reuben Goldmark and counterpoint with Max Spicker. He not only studied with Dvorak, but spent a good deal of time with him at his home. It was he who called to the attention of the great Bohemian composer the Negro spirituals, and is therefore in that degree responsible for the part they play in the quote, New World Symphony. In 1894, he had the unique distinction of being made baritone soloist at St. George's Church. Regarding this revolutionary innovation, Dr. William S. Rainsford, then rector of St. George's, says in his autobiography, quote, I broke the news to them, the St. George's Choir, that I was going to have for soloist a Negro, Harry Burleigh. Then division, consternation, confusion, and protest reigned for a time. I never knew how the troubled waters settled down. Indeed, I carefully avoided knowing who was for and who against my revolutionary arrangement. Nothing like it had even been known in the church's musical history. The thing was arranged, and I gave no opportunity for its discussion. End quote. The troubled waters did settle down, and Mr. Burleigh has held his position for now 36 years. In 1900, he became a member of the choir of Temple Emmanuel at 5th Avenue and 43rd Street, and at the time of his 25th year was given an engrossed testimonial expressing the appreciation of the congregation for his services. He has written more than 100 songs, besides his arrangements of the spirituals. Among them are Jean, Little Mother of Mine, Just You, The Young Warrior, and The Glory of the Day Was in Her Face. Mr. Johnson received his training at the New England Conservatory of Music, Boston. Mr. Cook studied at the Hochschule in Berlin and the violin under Joachim. These two men have worked in both the popular and the more classical field, but their reputations have been gained chiefly in the former. Mr. Burleigh, on the other hand, has consistently stuck to the latter. Mr. Johnson has had a varied musical career and has shown great versatility. He has written the music for Negro musical comedies. He has written scores for white Broadway musical comedies. He was the supervisor of music at the London Opera House, Oscar Hammerstein's venture in the English metropolis, and when Messrs. Harris and Lasky attempted to give New York something more Parisian than anything in the French capital in Hello Paris at the Folies Bergère, now the Fulton Theater, he wrote the music for that spicy revue, trained the members of the company, and conducted the orchestra. This being, it seems, the only time a Negro has conducted a white orchestra in a New York theater for a play with a white cast. He has written songs of every description, from a Mississippi roustabout frolic like Roll Dem Cotton Bells to a delicate love song like 3 Questions. The best known of his more ambitious songs are Since You Went Away, Little Gal, and The Awakening. He has arranged some 150 Negro spirituals, but his most widely sung composition is Lift Every Voice and Sing, a song that is used as a national hymn in colored schools and churches and at Negro gatherings all over the country. In the midst of the period we are now considering, another shift in the Negro population took place, and by 1900 there was a new center established in West 53rd Street. In this new center there sprang up a new phase of life among colored New Yorkers. 2 well-appointed hotels, the Marshall and the Maceo, run by colored men, were opened in the street and became the centers of a fashionable sort of life that hitherto had not existed. These hotels served dinner to music and attracted crowds of well-dressed people. On Sunday evenings the crowd became a crush, and to be sure of service one had to book a table in advance. This new center also brought about a revolutionary change in Negro artistic life. Those engaged in artistic effort deserted almost completely the old clubs farther downtown, and the Marshall, run by Jimmy Marshall, an accomplished Boniface, became famous as the headquarters of Negro talent. There gathered the actors, the musicians, the composers, the writers, and the better-paid vaudevillians. And there one went to get a close-up of Cole and Johnson, Williams and Walker, Ernest Hogan, Will Marion Cook, Jim Europe, Ada Overton, Abby Mitchell, Al Johns, Theodore Drury, Will Dixon, and Ford Dabney. Paul Laurence Dunbar was often there. A good many white actors and musicians also frequented the Marshall, and it was no unusual thing for some among the biggest Broadway stars to run up there for an evening. So there were always present numbers of those who loved to be in the light reflected from celebrities. Indeed, the Marshall for nearly 10 years was one of the sights of New York, for it was gay, entertaining, and interesting. To be a visitor there, without at the same time being a rank outsider, was a distinction. The Maceo, run by Benjamin F. Thomas, had the more staid clientele. In the brightest days of the Marshal, the temporary blight had not yet fallen on the Negro in the theater. Williams and Walker and Cole and Johnson were at their height. There were several good Negro road companies touring the country, and a considerable number of colored performers were on the big time in vaudeville. In the early 1900s, there came to the Marshal two young fellows, Ford Dabney and James Reese Europe, both of them from Washington, who were to play an important part in the artistic development of the Negro in a field that was, in a sense, new. It was they who first formed the colored New York entertainers who played instruments into trained, organized bands, and thereby became not only the daddies of the Negro jazz orchestras, but the granddaddies of the unnumbered jazz orchestras that have followed. Ford Dabney organized and directed a jazz orchestra which for a number of years was a feature of Florenz Ziegfeld's roof garden shows. Jim Europe organized the Clef Club. Joe Jordan also became an important factor in the development of Negro bands. How long Negro jazz bands throughout the country had been playing jazz at dances and in honky-tonks cannot be precisely stated, but the first modern jazz band ever heard on a New York stage, and probably on any other stage, was organized at the Marshal and made its debut at Proctor's 23rd Street Theater in the early spring of 1905. It was a playing, singing, dancing orchestra making dominant use of banjos, mandolins, guitars, saxophones, and drums in combination, and was called the Memphis Students. A very good name, overlooking the fact that the performers were not students and were not from Memphis. There was also a violin, a couple of brass instruments, and a double bass. The band was made up of about 20 of the best performers on the instruments mentioned above that could be got together in New York. They had all been musicians and entertainers for private parties, and as such had played together in groups varying in size, according to the amount the employing host wished to spend. Will Marion Cook gave a hand in whipping them into shape for their opening. They scored an immediate success. After the Proctor engagement, they went to Hammerstein's Victoria, playing on the vaudeville bill in that day, and on the roof garden at night. In the latter part of the same year, they opened at Olympia in Paris. From Paris, they went to the Palace Theatre in London, and then to the Schumann Circus in Berlin. They played all the important cities of Europe and were abroad a year. At the opening in New York, the performers who were being counted on to carry the stellar honors were Ernest Hogan, comedian, Abby Mitchell, soprano, Ida Forsyne, dancer, but while they made good, the band proved to be the thing. The instrumentalists were the novelty. There was one thing they did quite unconsciously, which, however, caused musicians who heard them to marvel at the feat. When the band played and sang, there were men who played one part while singing another. That is, for example, some of them, while playing the lead, sang bass, and some, while playing an alto part, sang tenor, and so on, in according with the instrument each man played and his natural voice. The Memphis Students deserve the credit that should go to pioneers. They were the beginners of several things that still persist as jazz band features. They introduced the dancing conductor. Will Dixon himself, a composer of some note, conducted the band here and on its European tour. All through a number, he would keep his men together by dancing out the rhythm, generally in graceful, sometimes in grotesque steps. Often an easy shuffle would take him across the whole front of the band. This style of directing not only got the fullest possible response from the men, but kept them in just the right humor for the sort of music they were playing. Another innovation they introduced was the trick-trap drummer. Buddy Gilmore was the drummer with the band, and it is doubtful if he has been surpassed as a performer of juggling and acrobatic stunts while manipulating a dozen noise-making devices aside from the drums. He made this style of drumming so popular that not only was it adopted by white professionals, but many white amateurs undertook to learn it as a social accomplishment, just as they might learn to do card tricks. The whole band, with the exception, of course, of the players on wind instruments, was a singing band, and it seems safe to say that they introduced the singing band, that is, a band singing in four-part harmony and playing at the same time. One of the original members of the Memphis Students was Jim Europe. Afterwards, he went for a season or two as the musical director with Cole and Johnson shows, and then in the same capacity with Bert Williams, Mr. Load of Cole. In 1910, he carried out an idea he had, an idea that had a business as well as an artistic reason behind it, and organized the Clef Club. He gathered all the colored professional instrumental musicians into a chartered organization and systematized the whole business of, quote-unquote, entertaining. The organization purchased a house in West 53rd Street and fitted it up as a club, and also as booking offices. Bands of from 3 to 30 men could be furnished at any time, day or night. The Clef Club for quite a while held a monopoly of the business of entertaining private parties and furnishing music for the dance craze, which was then just beginning to sweep the country. One year, the amount of business done amounted to $120,000. The crowning artistic achievement of the Clef Club was a concert given at Carnegie Hall in May 1912. The orchestra for the occasion consisted of 125 performers. It was an unorthodox combination, as is every true jazz orchestra. There were a few strings proper, the most of them being cellos and double basses. The few wind instruments consisted of cornets, saxophones, clarinets, and trombones. There was a battery of drums, but the main part of the orchestra was composed of banjos, mandolins, and guitars. On this night, all these instruments were massed against a background of 10 upright pianos. In certain parts, the instrumentation was augmented by the voices. New York had not yet become accustomed to jazz, so when the Clef Club opened its concert with a syncopated march, playing it with a biting attack and an infectious rhythm, and on the finale bursting into singing, the effect can be imagined. The applause became a tumult. It is possible that such a band as that could produce a similar effect even today. Later, Jim Europe, with his orchestra, helped to make Vernon and Irene Castle famous. When the World War came, he assembled the men for the band of the 15th, New York's noted Negro Regiment. He was with this band giving a concert in a Boston theater after their return from the war when he met his tragic end. 1912 was also the year in which there came up out of the South an entirely new genre of Negro songs, one that was to make an immediate and lasting effect upon American popular music, namely the blues. These songs are as truly folk songs as the spirituals, or as the original plantation songs, levee songs, and ragtime songs that had already been made the foundation of our national popular music. The blues were first set down and published by William C. Handy, a colored composer and for a while a band leader in Memphis, Tennessee. He put out the famous, quote, Memphis Blues and the still more famous St. Louis Blues, and followed them by blues of many localities and kinds. It was not long before the New York songwriters were turning out blues of every variety and every shade. Handy followed the blues to New York and has been a Harlemite ever since, where he is known as the quote-unquote father of the blues. It is from the blues that all that may be called American music derives its most distinctive characteristic. It was during the period we have just been discussing that the earliest attempt at rendering opera was made by Negroes in New York. Beginning in the first half of the decade 1900 to 1910 and continuing for 4 or 5 years, the Theodore Drury Opera Company gave annually one night of grand opera at the Lexington Opera House. Among the operas sung were Carmen, Ada, and Faust. These nights of grand opera were at least great social affairs and were looked forward to months ahead. In September 1928, H. Lawrence Freeman, a Negro musician and the composer of 6 grand operas, produced his opera Voodoo at the 52nd Street Theater. Mr. Freeman's operas are The Martyr, The Prophecy, The Octoroon, Plantation, Vendetta, and Voodoo. In the spring of the present year, he presented scenes from various of his works in Steinway Hall. He was the winner of the 1929 Harmon Award and Medal for Musical Composition. Chapter 12. The year 1900 marked another epoch for the Negro in New York. On the night of August 12th, a colored man named Arthur Harris left his wife on the corner of 8th Avenue and 41st Street for a moment to buy a cigar. When he returned, he found her struggling in the grasp of a white man. Harris engaged with the man and was struck by him over the head with a club. He retaliated with a pocket knife and inflicted a wound which proved fatal. He thereupon ran away. The white man was Robert J. Thorpe, a police officer in plain clothing, who claimed that he had arrested the woman for quote-unquote soliciting. Thorpe was very popular with his brother officers, and his funeral was attended by a large contingent of the police force. In addition to a great throng of friends, sympathizers, and those drawn by morbid curiosity, Harris had disappeared, and during the day of the funeral, the temper of the crowd to wreak vengeance upon some vicarious victim grew strong. As the day closed, rumors that there was going to be trouble flew faster and faster. Early in the evening of August 15th, the 4th Great New York Race Riot burst into full fury. A mob of several thousands raged up and down 8th Avenue and through the side streets from 27th to 42nd. Negroes were seized wherever they were found and brutally beaten. Men and women were dragged from streetcars and assaulted. When Negroes ran to policemen for protection, even begging to be locked up for safety, they were thrown back to the mob. The police themselves beat many Negroes as cruelly as did the mob. An intimate friend of mine was one of those who ran to the police for protection. He received such a clubbing at their hands that he had to be taken to the hospital to have his scalp stitched in several places. It was a beating from which he never fully recovered. During the height of the riot, the cry went out to, quote, "Get Ernest Hogan and Williams and Walker and Cole and Johnson." These seemed to be the only individual names the crowd was familiar with. Ernest Hogan was at the time playing at the New York Winter Garden in Times Square. For safety, he was kept in the theater all night. George Walker had a narrow escape. The riot of 1900 was a brutish orgy, which, if it was not incited by the police, was, to say the least, abetted by them. But this fourth of the great New York riots involving the Negro was really symptomatic of a national condition. The status of the Negro as a citizen had been declining for 25 years, and at the opening of the 20th century, his civil state was in some respects worse than at the close of the Civil War. At the opening of the 20th century, the war amendments passed in the Negro's behalf had been completely nullified or evaded in southern states, and he was disenfranchised, quote-unquote, Jim Crowed, outraged and denied the equal protection of the laws. In the decade ending in 1899, according to the records printed in the daily press, 1,665 Negroes were lynched, many of them with sadistic savagery, even by mutilation and by burning alive at the stake in the presence of great crowds. And these debauches and bestiality aroused no action on the part of the country, nor any general protest. The outlook was dark and discouraging. The Negro himself had in a large measure lost heart. The movement that Frederick Douglass had so valiantly carried forward had all but subsided. The general spirit of the race was one of hopelessness or acquiescence. The only way to survival seemed along the road of sheer opportunism and of conformity to the triumphant materialism of the age. Idealism linked with courage was scarcely discernible, nor did these conditions pertain solely to the South. The South lost the Civil War in 1865, but by 1900, in the fight waged on the Negro battlefront, it had conquered the North, and all through the old free states there was a tendency to concede that the grand experiment was a failure. Nowhere in the country was this decline in the spirit of self-assertion of rights more marked than in New York. A comparison between the times of Douglass, Garnett, and Cromwell and the opening of the new century was like a comparison between the light of a tropic noon and a winter twilight. But the riot of 1900 woke Negro New York and stirred the old fighting spirit. The answer to demands for an investigation of the riot was a series of excuses and delays on the part of the municipality and the police authorities. Then the colored citizens took steps to force action. A meeting was called at St. Mark's Church in West 53rd Street, and the Citizens Protective League was organized. The Reverend William H. Brooks, the pastor of the church, was made president. James E. Garner, a successful businessman, was made treasurer. And T. Thomas Fortune was elected chairman of the executive committee. Mr. Fortune was editor of the New York Age, the oldest Negro newspaper in New York, and a writer of marked ability. For many years he was the acknowledged leader in the Negro newspaper world, and for a while he contributed a regular column to the New York Sun. In ability and courage, he was a direct descendant of the leaders of 25 years before. The Citizens Protective League held a mass meeting in Carnegie Hall on September 12th, and funds were raised. The organization retained a lawyer to prosecute police officers, and its membership grew to about 5,000. The League, in a letter to Mayor Van Wyck, demanded the conviction and removal from the force of those officers it was able to prove guilty of malfeasance or nonfeasance. The mayor replied that the whole matter was in the hands of the police board. Finally, an investigation was held in which colored citizens who testified to having been beaten by the police were themselves treated as persons accused of crime, and the testimony of each was simply rebutted by policemen who were called to testify. The investigation turned out to be a sham and a whitewash. Nevertheless, the Negroes of New York, moved by this sudden realization of their danger, had taken a step towards making that city anew the chief radiating center of the forces contending for equal rights. A promising move in this same direction had been made in 1889 when T. Thomas Fortune issued a call for the formation of the thinking and progressive colored people of the country into a national organization to protest against the increasing disabilities and injustices to which the race was being subjected. The call was answered by 141 delegates from 21 states who met in Chicago January 15, 1890, and organized the Afro-American Council. J.C. Price, the head of Livingstone College in North Carolina, a man who had achieved considerable prestige as a leader, was chosen president, and T. Thomas Fortune, secretary. The following year, the council met at Knoxville, Tennessee, and Mr. Fortune succeeded Mr. Price as president. The organization then lay dormant until 1898, when Bishop Alexander Walters of New York, stirred by fresh outrages against Negroes, issued a call to Mr. Fortune to reassemble the council. The result was a meeting on September 15th of the same year at Rochester, New York, with 150 delegates present at the time when the monument to Frederick Douglass was being unveiled in that city. Another meeting was held at Washington in December to finish the business of the Rochester meeting. But the Afro-American Council did not realize its aim. It found it impossible to arouse the sort of spirit and response on the part of the colored people of the country necessary for the real growth of the organization, nor was it able to raise sufficient funds to create a permanent and efficient machine. So, after a somewhat languishing existence of several years longer, it died. But it had accomplished something. It had pointed the way. Not a new one, but the old one. And it was to be followed by a similar effort made in what was more nearly the fullness of time. In 1895, Booker T. Washington made his Atlanta speech. He had for 10 years prior to that occasion been a rising figure, but after it, his increase in power and prestige was so rapid that almost immediately he found himself the recognized leader of the Negro race. By his Atlanta speech, he had at a stroke gained the sanction and support of both the South and the North. The South in general, construing the speech to imply the Negro's abdication of his claim to full and equal citizenship rights and his acceptance of the status of a contented and industrious peasantry. The North, feeling that the opportunity had arisen to rid its conscience of a disturbing question, and shifted over to the South. The great body of the Negroes, discouraged, bewildered, and leaderless, hailed Mr. Washington as a Moses. This was indeed a remarkable feat, his holding the South in one hand, the North in the other, and at the same time carrying the major portion of his race along with him. The feat of uniting these three factions in the attempt to benefit the third had been tried before, but never achieved, and the founder of Tuskegee was the first to approach an accomplishment of it. The fact that he succeeded so far as he did, notwithstanding the popular conception of him as only an earnest educator and an energetic builder, stamps him as one of the world's ablest diplomats. At the height of his career, Booker T. Washington was by long odds the most distinguished man the South had produced after the era following that of the Civil War heroes. There can hardly be an intelligent American who would not be thrilled by the sheer romance of his life story. Born a slave amidst a squalor and poverty difficult to describe, as a child sleeping, quote, in and on a bundle of filthy rags laid upon the dirt floor, end quote, knowing nothing of his father, and set free at emancipation, a ragged, illiterate, penniless bit of humanity, not possessing even a name beyond Booker, he rose to make the name of his own known throughout the world, and to acquire a degree of power and influence second to that of no private individual in the country. Footnote: Booker T. Washington, Up from Slavery, New York, Doubleday, Page and Company. End of footnote. Born in a log cabin where there was no such thing as a table, but where the children were handed a piece of bread here and a scrap of meat there, he lived to sit at the table with the President of the United States and to sip tea with the Queen of England. There is no more magical page in the Arabian Nights. Dr. Washington encountered criticism from men of his own race. His critics felt that he was yielding more than what would be the ultimate worth of what he gained. The criticism grew louder, but it was not formulated, and the dissenters were without an authoritative voice. There was criticism of the fact that the doctrine of industrial education had been interpreted as meaning that it was the only education the Negro race would need to fit it for the place it was to occupy. There was also criticism of the minifying of political and civil rights. Over against these criticisms stood the great concrete demonstration, Tuskegee, endorsed by the South, supported by the North, and not only doing a tremendous work for the Negroes of the South, but wielding an increasing influence on educational ideas with regard to the white youth of the country. In the face of these solid achievements, the criticisms took on a doctrinaire aspect, an aspect of bickering and fault-finding. In 1903, a book came out of Atlanta, written by a professor at Atlanta University. The book was The Souls of Black Folk, and the author was W.E.B. Du Bois. The author of The Souls of Black Folk, like the author of Up from Slavery, was a Negro. But aside from that, their antecedents were quite different. Du Bois was born 2 years after the close of the Civil War in a beautiful, cultured New England town, Great Barrington, Massachusetts. He was educated in the grammar and high schools of his native town, then at Fisk University, then at Harvard, and then at the University of Berlin. He experienced the pride of knowing his ancestry. 3 generations of his forebears lay in the Great Barrington Cemetery. When he began active life, it was with greater intellectual preparation than any American Negro had yet acquired. This book of his was at once hailed as a great book. It was a collection of essays, one of which was headed, quote, "Of Mr. Washington and Others," end quote, and contained an estimate of Booker T. Washington and a statement of the points on which the author differed with him. Because of the criticism it voiced, this chapter in the book immediately became the subject of a nationwide controversy, especially sharp in the South, and the guns of criticism were turned upon Du Bois. But the chief significance of this essay lies in the effect wrought by it within the race. It brought about a coalescence of the more radical elements and made them articulate, thereby creating a split of the race into 2 contending camps, between which there has been a rapprochement only within the past 10 years. A rapprochement achieved mostly through the moving over of the conservative group. And so, with the issuance of a book from Atlanta, a new leader stepped forth, and Du Bois found himself at the head of the scattered and almost silent remnants of the old militant Negro element. Dr. Du Bois planned to bring the Negro militants together, and in answer to a call sent out by him, a conference was held July 11th to 13th, 1905 at Buffalo, New York. 29 colored men were present from 13 states and the District of Columbia. 3 states of the Old South, Georgia, Tennessee, and Virginia, were represented. A national organization was formed and called, quote-unquote, the Niagara Movement. In the Constitution that was adopted, the following objects were stated: A. Freedom of speech and criticism. B. An unfettered and unsubsidized press. C. Manhood suffrage. D. The abolition of all caste distinctions based simply on race and color. E. The recognition of the principles of human brotherhood as a practical present creed. F. The recognition of the highest and best human training as the monopoly of no class or race. G. A belief in the dignity of labor. H. United effort to realize these ideals under wise and courageous leadership. The following year, in August, the Niagara Movement met at Harper's Ferry, the scene of John Brown's martyrdom, and adopted and sent out an address to the country, which in part read: The men of the Niagara Movement, coming from the toil of the year's hard work, and pausing for a moment from the earning of their daily bread to turn toward the nation and ask, in the name of 10 million, the privilege of a hearing. In the past year, the work of the Negro hater has flourished in the land. Step by step, the defenders of the rights of American citizens have retreated. The work of stealing the black man's ballot has progressed, and the 50 and more representatives of stolen votes still sit in the nation's capital. Discrimination in travel and public accommodation has so spread that some of our weaker brethren are actually afraid to thunder against colored discrimination as such, and are simply whispering for ordinary decencies. Against this, the Niagara Movement eternally protests. We will not be satisfied to take one jot or tittle less than our full manhood rights. We claim for ourselves every single right that belongs to a free-born American, political, civil, and social. And until we get these rights, we will never cease to protest and assail the ears of America. The battle we wage is not for ourselves alone, but for all true Americans. It is a fight for ideals, lest this, our common fatherland, false to its founding, become in truth the land of the thief and the home of the slave, a byword and a hissing among the nations for its sounding pretensions and pitiful accomplishment. Never before in the modern age has a great and civilized folk threatened to adopt so cowardly a creed in the treatment of its fellow citizens born and bred on its soil. Stripped of verbiage and subterfuge, and in its naked nastiness, the new American creed says, "Fear to let black men even try to rise, lest they become the equals of the whites." And this is the land that professes to follow Jesus Christ. The blasphemy of such a course is only matched by its cowardice. In detail, our demands are clear and unequivocal. First, we would vote. With the right to vote goes everything: freedom, manhood, the honor of your wives, the chastity of your daughters, the right to work, and the chance to rise. And let no man listen to those who deny this. We want full manhood suffrage, and we want it now, henceforth and forever. Second, we want discrimination in public accommodation to cease. Separation in railway and streetcars, based simply on race and color, is un-American, undemocratic, and silly. We protest against all such discrimination. Third, we claim the right of free men to walk, talk, and be with them that wish to be with us. No man has a right to choose another man's friends, and to attempt to do so is an impudent interference with the most fundamental human privilege. Fourth, we want the laws enforced against rich as well as poor, against capitalist as well as laborer, against white as well as black. We are not more lawless than the white race. We are more often arrested, convicted, and mobbed. We want justice, even for criminals and outlaws. We want the Constitution of the country enforced. We want Congress to take charge of congressional elections. We want the 14th Amendment carried out to the letter, and every state disfranchised in Congress which attempts to disenfranchise its rightful voters. We want the 15th Amendment enforced, and no state allowed to base its franchise simply on color. The failure of the Republican Party in Congress at the session just closed to redeem its pledge of 1904 with reference to suffrage conditions at the South seems a plain, deliberate, and premeditated breach of promise, and stamps that party as guilty of obtaining votes under false pretenses. Fifth, we want our children educated. The school system in the country districts of the South is a disgrace, and in few towns and cities are the Negro schools what they ought to be. We want the national government to step in and wipe out illiteracy in the South. Either the United States will destroy ignorance, or ignorance will destroy the United States. And when we call for education, we mean real education. We believe in work. We ourselves are workers. But work is not necessarily education. Education is the development of power and ideal. We want our children trained as intelligent human beings should be, and we will fight for all time against any proposal to educate black boys and girls simply as servants and underlings, or simply for the use of other people. They have a right to know, to think, to aspire. These are some of the chief things which we want. How shall we get them? By voting where we may vote, by persistent, unceasing agitation, by hammering at the truth, by sacrifice and work. Reading today the chapter from The Souls of Black Folks of Mr. Washington and others, it is perhaps impossible for those unfamiliar with the period to understand the extent of the reaction it caused and the bitterness of the animosities it aroused. The latter, at any rate, was due to causes not specifically contained in what Dr. Du Bois had written, but outside of it. The essay was not an attack. It contained no word of denunciation. Neither was there in it invective or irony, two of the author's favorite and most effective weapons. It was, in fact, a temperate analysis of Dr. Washington's position and policy and a rationally stated difference on certain points. The spirit of the whole essay can be fairly illustrated by two quotations, one near the beginning and the other near the end. To gain the sympathy and cooperation of the various elements comprising the white South was Mr. Washington's first task, and this, at the time Tuskegee was founded, seemed for a black man impossible. And yet, 10 years later, it was done in the words spoken at Atlanta. Quote, "In all things purely social, we can be as separate as the 5 fingers, and yet one as the hand in all things essential to material progress." End quote. This Atlanta Compromise is by all odds the most notable thing in Mr. Washington's career. The South interpreted it in different ways. The radicals received it as a complete surrender of the demand for civil and political equality. The conservatives as a generously conceived working basis for mutual understanding. So both approved it, and today its author is certainly the most distinguished Southerner since Jefferson Davis, and the one with the greatest personal following. The black men of America have a duty to perform, a duty stern and delicate, a forward movement to oppose a part of the work of their greatest leader. So far as Mr. Washington preaches thrift, patience, and industrial training for the masses, we must hold up his hands and strive with him, rejoicing in his honors and glorying in the strength of this Joshua called of God and of a man to lead the headless host. But so far as Mr. Washington apologizes for injustice, North or South, does not rightly value the privilege and duty of voting, belittles the emasculating effects of caste distinctions, and opposes the higher training and ambition of our brightest minds. So far as he, the South, or the nation does this, we must increasingly and firmly oppose them. Much has happened, and many changes have occurred in the North and the South since those words were written. Last year, the present head of Tuskegee, Dr. R.R. Moulton, wrote a book, What the Negro Thinks. Footnotes: Robert Russa Moulton, What the Negro Thinks, Garden City, Doubleday, Duran and Company, 1929. End of footnote. Which was in substance a restatement of the objects set forth by the Niagara movement, and in answer he received words of approbation from the Southern press. The two groups, once so sharply divided, are today practically one. With regard to the fundamental aims of the American Negro, Dr. Moulton says in his book, quote, "In truth, they are working for the same thing in different spheres and by a different approach." End quote. In truth, they have learned that a coordinated plan of battle calls for the militants to act as shock troops and for the conservatives to advance rapidly and hold the ground. One of the visitors at the Harper's Ferry meeting of the Niagara movement was Miss Mary White Ovington of New York, one of the few remaining inheritors of the abolition spirit, who had for several years been studying the condition of the Negro in the North and in the South. She went to report the conference for the New York Evening Post. In the fall of 1908, William English Walling had an article in the Independent on the race riots which had recently taken place in Springfield, Illinois, Abraham Lincoln's old home, in which Negroes had been beaten and killed in the streets of that city. After describing the brutalities committed upon colored people in that outbreak, Mr. Walling declared, quote, "Either the spirit of the abolitionist, of Lincoln, and of Lovejoy must be revived, and we must come to treat the Negro on a plane of absolute political and social equality, or Vardaman and Tillman will soon have transferred the race war to the North." Miss Ovington wrote to Mr. Walling and later talked with him over the matter, together with Dr. Henry Moskowitz, early in January 1909. Plans were discussed for making a demonstration on February 12th, the 100th anniversary of Abraham Lincoln's birth. Oswald Garrison Villiard joined with the movement, and on Lincoln's birthday a call for a conference, drafted by Mr. Villiard, was issued. Among the liberal whites who signed the call were Charles Edward Russell, Jane Addams, Samuel Bowles, John Dewey, Mary E. McDowell, John Haynes Holmes, Florence Kelly, Lillian D. Wald, John E. Milholland, Rabbi Stephen S. Wise, and William Dean Howells. Among the Negro liberals who joined in were Dr. W.E. Burghardt Du Bois, Bishop Alexander Walters, Ida Wells Barnett, and the Reverend Francis J. Grimke. Charles Edward Russell, who had also talked with Mr. Walling following the appearance of the Independent article, was the presiding genius at the more or less stormy closing sessions of this first conference, when a temporary organization was formed. In May 1910, a second conference was held in New York, at which there was a consummated merger of the forces of the Negro liberals of the Niagara movement and the white liberals of the abolition traditions, thus forming the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The platform adopted was practically the same as that of the Niagara movement. It was commented upon at the time as being extremely radical. In this same year, the association called Dr. Du Bois to come as its director of publicity and research. He resigned his professorship at Atlanta University and came to New York, and the publication of The Crisis, a monthly magazine, the organ of the association, with Dr. Du Bois as editor, was begun. The Crisis has now been doing pioneer work for 20 years, and Dr. Du Bois, more than any other one man, paved the way for the quote-unquote new Negro. At about this time, two other strong friends became allied with this movement, J.E. Spingarn and Arthur B. Spingarn. The association has grown to be a powerful and effective organization. It has national headquarters in New York City and more than 300 branches in 44 states. Its record of accomplishment in the past 20 years is extraordinary. Besides its work in legal defense and its fight against lynching and against discriminations in the administration of the law, in facilities for education, and in the use of common carriers and place of public accommodation, it has carried to the United States Supreme Court and won 4 important and far-reaching decisions affecting the constitutional and citizenship rights of the American Negro. These were decisions in the Louisville segregation case, the Arkansas peonage cases, the Texas white primary case, and the New Orleans segregation case. In addition, it had a hand in winning the quote-unquote grandfather clause case. Footnote: grandfather clauses began to be adopted in the constitutions of the southern states in 1898. They were disenfranchising devices, in that they laid down as necessary to the right of suffrage a list of property, literacy, and character qualifications, and then provided that none of these qualifications need to be met by any person who had the right to vote or had an ancestor who had the right to vote at the time of the close of the Civil War. The Supreme Court declared these clauses unconstitutional in 1915. End of footnote. One of the reasons for this degree of success in prosecuting the Negro's cause through the courts has been the fact that the association had the voluntary services of such lawyers as Moorfield Story, Lewis Marshall, Clarence Darrow, James A. Cobb, Charles H. Studin, and Arthur B. Spingarn as members of its legal committee. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People was the first and is still the only organization since the Anti-Slavery Society providing a common medium for the cooperation of blacks and whites in the work of securing and safeguarding the common citizenship rights of the Negro. With the founding of this association, New York became again the center of the organized forces of self-assertion, of equal rights, and of insistence upon the impartial application of the fundamental principles of the Republic without regard to race, creed, or color. Shortly following the formation of the Advancement Association, steps were taken which led to the establishment of another important national organization to work for the Negro. With headquarters in New York, the National League on Urban Conditions Among Negroes. Among those who took part in the founding of the organization were Mrs. Ruth Standish Baldwin, Edwin R. A. Seligman, Fred R. Moore, Miss Elizabeth Walton, L. Hollingsworth Wood, George E. Haynes, and Eugene Kinkle Jones. The main purpose for which this organization was formed was to work for the industrial, social, and health betterment of the colored people, especially those living in urban centers. In addition to working for these ends, the Urban League has carried on research work and collected a great deal of valuable data and statistics on industrial, social, and health conditions among Negroes. It has grown rapidly and now has affiliated branches in the principal cities in all sections of the country. Each of these branch offices is manned by a trained secretary and social workers. The Urban League, like the Advancement Association, is an organization in which both races cooperate. 10 years after the forming of these two bodies, another organization destined to make Negro history in New York was in full swing. The Garvey Movement. The Negro population in 1910 of all the boroughs of the city was 91,709, and of Manhattan alone, 60,500